So the way I'd like to do this is I'm going to have, I have a few sort of prompt questions here, some things to kind of get us rolling, get the juices flowing, but then certainly if you all come up, I will periodically call on people at the mic. So if the spirit moves you to come to the mic and ask a question, I will direct it over there periodically between questions here. So to get us going, I'd like to give a point of preference for a moment to our three panelists who have not yet given talks, and then we'll open up to everybody. So Dr. Gato, Dr. Siegel, you're off the hook for a few minutes. And I'd like to ask the three of you to think about, reflect on the day and think about one thing that you've heard or one theme that has come up that has either excited you, surprised you, or worried you in the context of this question of psychiatric comorbidity and ASD. And so we'll start with Dr. Romas, and then we'll move down the line.
I don't know how the microphone went to my hand, but somehow I feel like a lounge singer. But I'm going to just go ahead and say that there's so many things about today that have excited and affirmed my thoughts around where the field should be going and seems to be going. And and I'm delighted to be part of this movement in the field and this important change. Most importantly, this recognition that so many of the people we support, in addition to having a developmental disability diagnosis, are not only at risk for, but are likely to have a co-occurring psychiatric condition. I think that's so critical to our ability to respond prescriptively to the needs of this population. In private conversations between so many of the principals here, I've suggested that when I first arrived on the field, which was in the 1800s, truly the kind of care, the kind of treatment that we were able to provide was largely custodial, and we were so far past that with what I'll term now the Industrial Revolution, which was the advent of ABA, spearheaded largely by Dr. Ted Carr. And here we are, all these years later, at another critical juncture where we're able to recognize and respond to the great likelihood of comorbidities and make our responses to the population, so much more robust to include a real understanding of the complexity of mental illness as it overlays on the profiles of persons with developmental disabilities. And just lastly, before I turn the microphone over, I just want to, I'd like to affirm again and kind of state clearly how proud I am to be part of GDI, who is always seemed to be at the forefront, and now as part of the Center of Excellence, delightfully as part of the Center of Excellence, to champion this next wave of great understanding around treatment, which will have such enormous implications for training and intervention. Dr. Matt Lerner, who is kind enough to mediate this, moderate this panel, has been a guest on DDI's very own radio show, which I host, which is kind of an analog to Autism Speaks, which is meant to say that, right here on Long Island, we can be a resource to respond to the many questions that people have around not only autism, but to complexity and the kind of things that just seem to fall right out of the, it seems like there's not, and this has been a recurring theme throughout the day, and I'm so delighted for it, that, that a one size does not fit all, that the people that we support are indeed complex, and they need a forum and a response to that really gets that. So thank you, thank you for allowing me to be part of that, and thank you to all of you for participating in this event.
Thanks.
Pleasure.
Well, I think the thing that excites me most has been the food today.
Yeah, it's good food.
I want to take it home. Please save it and give me a bag. The thing that stood out the most today was Ken's research about autism and ADHD having the highest incidence of schizophrenia out of all the subgroups. I thought that was fascinating and confirms what I've seen anecdotally. And I would love to figure out why that happens, because I'd never thought of it before. So that was great. Thanks, Ken.
I'm going to refer to my notes. Once Matt gave me my 3 words, I was taking notes. So, I guess, for me, today was a little bit of a complicated day. It was sort of very child-focused, which I know is something that I have to run into all the time. So my first suggestion is, yay, adult conference next time. Let's talk about comorbidities there, because we have more. We had a lifetime to catch them, so we've got them. And that was a big one. The one for me that I was really glad to see was a lot of the languages changing within the researchers. I was glad to hear some really big efforts to have heard the autism community's request that we are careful about language. Something as simple as using the term comorbidity can be really frightening to people on the spectrum as well as their families. So instead, saying something, as Ken said, like co-occurring conditions can be something that A, makes more sense because it does co-occur with their ASD, and also it's less frightening. So that was sort of a big, yay, I'm glad to see it's making its way. I've talked about it so much, I can't wait to see it keep going. We talked about crisis management today. I was really, really glad to hear that. Many of us on the spectrum, when we're in crisis, do not have anywhere to go, and we certainly don't know how to help ourselves and are paralyzed at that moment, even to be able to help ourselves. So I ask that if you work within crisis management, yes, thank you, it's a hard job, and I appreciate it, the parents appreciate it, but please make sure that you keep in mind, it's as disturbing and disrupting to the person who is having that crisis as it is to the team, and the words and the way that you talk to these people when it's occurring, and the words that you use when you're in the room with them, even if you're not talking directly to them but to somebody else, are heard, are understood. You're talking about a person that is in that room. So if we can just make sure that we're careful with our language. My other really big takeaway, super good one, goodbye didactics. Who said that? Somebody said no more didactics, right? Brilliant. I'm so over didactics. I can take a test in anything. I can memorize anything. That helps me 0 in real life. None. Because human beings are unpredictable. So it doesn't help me. It doesn't help me in the life. But when you teach something to somebody as an activity, and they have maintained the muscle correlation, and they start to do things actively in the moment, in real time, it's a totally different experience for the individual and an experience for the person working with that individual. So please keep that in mind. It's hard to learn something when it's just on a piece of paper. It doesn't really help you to do laundry, to have the instructions on a piece of paper. I guess, create Brent's Mayor quote. I actually wrote that down. Thank you for that. And then, let's see, what else? Oh, my soapbox, yes, adults. Please, the adults and the women, we're here. We talk a lot. We're usually the hyperverbal people. So please come find the women. We will tell you everything in about 30 seconds. Glad to hear the adults are being included in studies and that the women are coming. I met with Ken about that. It's something that's really important to the adult community. We're out there. The women are being found more quickly now. We're coming out louder. We're being found with our children. We're also being found with our spouses. We deal with the complex issues of adulthood. The comorbidities are more complicated. Many of us have kids that are on the spectrum, as well as being on the spectrum ourselves. Those are really big concerns for us. And I think my greatest takeaway and my most disturbing takeaway from today was how little information we have about something that we all know is happening. Like, this is a craziness to me. That's absolutely absurd. I have never, in all of these years since I got my diagnosis and I've been in this field, met a single person with autism who just had autism. Never. I have never seen it. I don't think I'll ever see it. It's just not possible. You're a human being. We all come with conditions. And so I say, this is a conversation. Let's talk about all of the co-occurring stuff that goes on. Not just the medical stuff, not just the psychiatric stuff, all of the life stuff that goes on. Those create and inform the anxiety and the depression and all of the other psychiatric conditions that come along with ASD. So.
Thank you. And not to exclude you, Dr. Siegel, Dr. Gato, if either of you want to respond to the question of anything today that either excited you, surprised you, or worried you about what you heard, you may. And if you'd rather not, that's fine. And while they're responding, if anyone has questions, you can come to the mic. We'll have more.
I just thought it was exciting to have so many people who are interested in this topic and focused on it. And I've had some great conversations with people in the hallway, et cetera, and just there seems to be a lot of excitement around just looking at what someone with autism is going through in a more complex way, outside a single discipline, and that to me is very encouraging.
We heard a lot about assessment today in one form or another, either from broad sample perspectives, groups that are incredibly hard to capture. For those of you who don't know, hearing about AIC and then hearing about the COE project, the people in this room have now heard more about assessing psychiatric comorbidity in more impaired and minimally verbal folks with autism than most scientists in the field have heard about such populations now. They're incredibly, incredibly hard to assess and study, and it's happening here. So, I'll just interject, I thought that was exciting to hear about, if hard. So I guess, based on what we have heard today, I'm curious from the panelists, I'm curious if anybody has ideas about what we can do to do a better job of assessing comorbidity or co-occurring conditions. Thank you, Becca. Either in the populations who are maybe being treated in the CRPs, or for that matter, in folks before, or hopefully even those who might not be routed to that context.
This brings up something I've been thinking about all day, which is a long conversation that you probably heard before, but the DSM is not working in this area. They took a step back with the most recent edit in terms of specificity, of delineating different types of people on the autism spectrum, and I understand why, which is, as far as I can tell, they kind of gave up because it's hard. But one thing I've been thinking about all day is the co-occurring disorders seem to be a pretty decent way to delineate subtypes of autism. That said, defining those co-occurring disorders is in and of itself quite difficult and arguably impossible. There are some parts of the DSM I would argue are not valid because they're just side effects of other disorders the DSM already has. But I do think the differences between me and certain, the wide variety of autistic people could be explained using different co-occurring conditions. And one thing I'll close with is, when I teach about this stuff, I always say, what else is a spectrum besides autism? And people say, well, rainbow's color spectrum. And most people can tell the difference between green and red. But at a certain point, you say, well, that's green-blue, I can't differentiate green and blue. And I suspect this is why the DSM-5 gave up on differentiating Asperger's and other types of autism, because there's plenty of people who fall in that green-blue designation. As such, I don't think we should get rid of green and blue as separate colors, because we do know what they are when we see them a lot of the time. And again, I feel like perhaps co-occurring conditions would be one way of differentiating us along the autism spectrum, because the interventions and the treatment you would need would be very different based on those. But again, co-occurring conditions, so many of them are just symptoms of underlying causes of other stuff. So, as with any descriptive tool, this will be very hard. But that was something I was thinking about today that perhaps could improve a whole lot of these things. And I hope that answers your question, Matt. Anyone else?
So the things I was thinking about in response to Matt's question are, you know, measurement, training, and access, each of which is obviously a big topic, but I think we heard a lot today about the need for clinically useful measures that can help screen and diagnose in individuals with autism, and I think the CASI is a really good place to start. And so, you know, some good work has gone on around that. But even getting to, you know, there are several groups working on, I think someone mentioned, there's a group working on, I think what is probably going to likely be a pretty good anxiety measure in autism. So just to give you a little context there. So, you know, when I went through training, you know, 10 or 12 years ago, 15 years ago, we learned, as you know, a big part of the training is like, so what measures are you going to use? So when a kid comes in and you're worrying about depression, then, you know, we learned about the Children's Depression Inventory and the, you know, a couple other measures of anxiety. We learned about the MASC, and we learned about, you know, the various measures. And we don't, right now, in our, what we think is our sophisticated, you know, autism multidisciplinary outpatient clinic, we don't have a battery of measures that we give that we think are valid and specific to, you know, this area. And so I would like to see us in, as soon as possible, but probably within 5 years, 8 years, be able to say, you know, let's give this anxiety measure and let's give this depression measure. We can also use a broad measure such as the CASI, and that also can be informative, and a lot of clinics do that for neurotypical kids coming in. But that's where I'd like us to go on measurement. In terms of training, that's something I worry about, and it goes straight to access, which is how are we going to develop and provide providers, psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, developmental behavioral pediatricians who are knowledgeable in this area and can treat people with autism with, you know, more than just, oh yeah, I remember that risperidone looked good in the pediatrics article from 2002, so maybe we should just use that, right? We have to get beyond that point. That was somewhat of an advance, but, you know, but that's about training. You can't think this stuff up, right? You have to have some training, and so I've been working with the Academy. So we're trying some efforts through the American Academy of Child Health and Psychiatry to get more into the training curriculum for medical students and for psychiatry residents. We're trying to offer advanced training for child psychiatry fellows, but that's a real need area. I mean, here's the reality, right? There's less than 1,000 developmental behavioral pediatricians in the United States. There are 13,000 child psychiatrists in the United States, a large portion of whom are research or administration, whatever. So usually people say there's about 8,000 or 9,000 effectively child psychiatrists in the whole country, which is like a drop, you know, in the bucket. And so I worry a lot about training and access. We're going to have to look at other models. You know, there just aren't enough people to see all the folks. So that goes to access. And I guess I covered that, but that's something we're trying to work on, but I think it's a big challenge.
I think just one thing that I would add to this, I'm going to make this comment brief because it really doesn't impact most of you in this room. But as Kenny mentioned in my introduction, I'm involved in a very large-scale study of children and adolescents with HIV in Uganda. And the Uganda study is based on a study that I and my colleague Sharon Nachman conducted in the United States. But for that study, they needed to translate the CASI into Luganda. And Luganda is one of 40 languages spoken in Uganda, but it's one of the more common languages. And that experience introduced me to issues in world psychiatry. Now, Uganda has a population of 26 million people, approximately 26 million people, and there is one child psychiatrist for the entire country of Uganda. I mention that to underscore the importance of the worldwide assessment issues in autism spectrum disorder. We have it easy here in the United States in the sense that we have access to a lot of wonderful instruments, institutions, scientists, and so forth. But I think the backbone of the initiative in many other countries in the world will be the development of instruments and the delivery of services through more practical healthcare delivery systems. And they are going to be social workers, nurses. Lower level isn't the right word, but you know what I'm trying to say. If you're in a country that only has one child psychiatrist, you have to work out the delivery of these services that it's going to be practical, affordable, and that would be something I would like to see in the assessment area.
Can I respond to that? Well, actually, I'm not responding, I'm just really just adding to that. You know, based on a recent review of Dr. Alan Packer's work at the Simons Foundation, it seems like there are over 1,000 genes implicated in the etiology of autism, of which approximately 40 converge on a single pathway, which may have some really nice biological implications for pharmacology. But what I wanted to share with our group is that, from my understanding, is that these same genes also overlap with other mental health concerns, like schizophrenia, like depression, like bipolar. So when we were talking in the conversation today around the short and longer genes and how they can get switched on and off based on a function of environmental interaction, there are so many permutations, almost infinite permutations around what this can look like, that it's really important that I believe that we get comfortable with the idea of responding to a profile or a symptomology rather than just a clean, easy diagnosis. There's nothing clean and easy about a diagnosis of autism. That's why it now falls on a spectrum and is likely to fall on something even larger down the road. It's clearly a neuronal disorder, but what is it really? So we're really left with this question, you know, will the real autism please stand up, right? So we're really faced with this enormous challenge of saying, gee, what part of this profile falls in this bucket of autistic-like behavior and profile and symptomology, and what part of it profiles, falls in this more psychiatric profile. And rather than be bound by some kind of diagnostic dictate, I would urge the responsive medical and behavioral and psychiatric community to be much more invested in what it looks like and how we treat rather than what we call it.
So that's actually a nice, excellent transition to what I was going to ask next, which is that you know, Noah was talking about this idea of, you know, maybe we can think about subtyping autism by the presence of different comorbidities, and Becca made the provocative point that she's never met somebody with autism who doesn't. And I'm reminded of an equally provocative idea, which I want to sort of throw out to the panel. So, not this past year, not last month, but a year before, Dr. Chris Gilberg from Sweden won the Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Society for Autism Research. And in his acceptance address, he put forth this idea that he's written about for a long time, which is this idea of sort of autism minus and autism plus. And what he described, he says basically you have autism symptoms, just the core symptoms of autism, right? The social symptoms and the trigger repetitive behaviors. And he calls that autism minus. And he says that does exist, but he said that that is not a disorder. He thinks that is just a way that some people exist in the world. And that's not inherently impairing. So here he is at like the International Meeting for Autism Research, right? All the top, all the big autism researchers in the world, and he says in front of a room full of everybody, autism is not an impairing disorder, period. And he said that instead he actually proposed a variant on what Noah just proposed, which is this idea that autism plus is autism plus epilepsy, autism plus intellectual disability, autism plus ADHD, autism plus anxiety, and that autism plus is much more common than autism minus, but that the source of impairment, he says, is that autism kind of can act like a magnet towards some of these other things. So the plus is not just plus the other thing, but also like the polarity of a magnet, and that in doing so it sort of draws these other conditions to it. And I've thought a lot about that since it happened, since he said it, and I still don't know what to make of it. So I'm curious. I'd like to put this to our expert panel. What do you all think about this idea? And we just had this whole conference about autism and comorbidity. What about the idea that autism is not? I'll ask the question that Chris Gilberg proposed, right? Is autism not inherently impairing?
When I was on IAC 4 years ago, Sue Sweeto came to talk about the proposed or impending change in the DSM diagnostic criteria of getting rid of Asperger's, and she went over it, and I don't even remember what her explanation was, but I asked her, are you still allowing space for those of us who don't qualify as having a disorder but who are just autistic people? And she said, no, we worked very hard to make sure that isn't an option. And she said, because if you don't currently qualify as having a disorder based on the description than you did before. And I kind of stopped talking to her because I don't see any ground possible with this conversation. I'm going to just leave it. It made me wonder if that had ever been true of me, and I don't think it had. I don't think that I would have ever qualified as having significant impairment in a relevant area, or having, the most important criterion for any psychiatrist to make a diagnosis of having a functional behavioral assessment, or whatever it is, the GAF or whatever it's called, general assessment of functioning, below 60. I don't think that would have ever happened to me at any age. That said, I'm pretty obviously autistic. I'm aware of this. I think everyone who knows me knows this. So I've always felt the way that Chris did in Matt's description, that sure, yeah, I mean, you can be autistic in the sense that you can also be, short. Doesn't mean anything's wrong with you, that's just who you are. You're in a minority, and that's okay. That said, Becca makes me think about the fact that a whole lot of people on the autism spectrum do have co-occurring conditions, and this is significantly more common in this population. And why is that? And that's something that all of us have been thinking about for years. The GI ones are the most obvious and speak to the fact that there's definitely a medical abnormality here. As to whether it actually creates psychological problems or just creates cultural and psychological differences I think that varies based on the person, but unfortunately the medical stuff, is pretty inarguable, as this, GI problems are not something anybody wants and everybody admits is terrible and they want to get rid of. So perhaps, if you can find these autistic people that he's referring to with 0 co-occurring conditions, good for them, they're doing great. I don't see anything wrong with them. I don't know any reason you would change them. But for most of us, there are these co-occurring conditions, so I think this guy sounds like he's onto something. They should give him an award.
Seriously, the minute you said that, I was like, oh, I have to meet my hero. Where is he? Go find me.
It's in Sweden.
Because I really, really, really have been talking about this, I think probably as long as I've known you, right? People say to me, what's it like to have autism? I say, I don't know, what's it like to not have autism, right? I have no idea what your life is like without it. I only know what my life is like, and they tell me I have autism, so this is what life is like for me. That's all I can do. What I can tell you is that the world generally doesn't care about my autism. They care about my anxiety and my depression, because my anxiety and my depression are the things that interrupt my life. Those are the things that I've developed over the years. I don't know exactly if I was born with them or not, but I've had them for a very long time. Gathering that the anxiety came first, it's the one I remember coming first. Untreated, it went and became depression. But the anxiety, I think, is so innately a piece of autism, because if autism is the filter through which we experience the world, and the world to us seems so incredibly infused with information, and it's overwhelming, and it's constantly feeling like that, but that's how the world is to you all the time, of course you're going to develop anxiety. It's practically PTSD you're setting up. You're asking for people to walk around in a world in which they are bombarded with information that is A, unimportant to them, B, non-necessary information. Some of it is social and construct and unimportant to the actual goings-on of life. And those things add a social pressure that creates the anxiety, or creates the psychiatric conditions, different from the ones that we see that are biochemical. So it's, are we dealing with something that's medical? Are we dealing with something that's psychiatric? Are we dealing with something that belongs in its other category, right? That's the hardest part. Do I need a neurologist or a psychiatrist? Where are you sending me? You send me to both, you send me to one or the other. Some people say go to the neurologist, some people say go to the psychiatrist. I have to go to both, I have migraines too. Like, who cares who you're going to see? The concept is, my autism doesn't make me not a person. It doesn't make me not a human. It doesn't make me not affected by human behaviors and human goings-on. I don't escape those things. As a woman, I don't have the female protective effect. I was not born with this protection. I go out into the world and I have to deal with it all the time. I work really hard to make sure that the ways that my autism affects my life and the way that I integrate and form relationships with people and go about my life, it's really when I'm not taking care of my anxiety and my depression that I run into trouble. The autism itself, if they had caught it when I was a little kid and maybe I didn't develop anxiety and depression, I would have been one of those people with nothing but autism, and I would have been totally fine. Frankly, till I was 8 years old and it became important to socialize with other kids, I was a totally happy kid. I was fine by myself. I didn't want other people in my play kitchen. Get out. I was not a kid that really wanted it, and I was fine with that. I was perfectly happy. But it was other people's concerns. She's not socializing. That's weird for a girl. Right? Weird, so weird. Why? Girls are mean. That's awful. I don't want to be friends with them. Why would I want to? But those questions weren't asked. It was never educated to me as a child, the vocabulary that I needed. As somebody with emotional regulation issues and emotional integration issues, I don't really, still as an adult, I don't have all the words to label my feelings, right? Especially they get complicated. I just recently at home was feeling a particular way, and I've been feeling this particular way for a couple of days, but I didn't have the words, so I was searching. And I actually had to go on Google and Google images of words that I thought would show me what I was feeling. And when I found the picture that looked right, it had a word, melancholy. And I'm like, yeah, I'm feeling melancholy. Discovery, I have a word. But if we're not providing our kids on the spectrum with those words, you're not going to get the communication. You're always going to be stumbling against those blocks. As a kid, I could have told you I was nervous. I could have told you I was upset. I could have told you I was uncomfortable. I could have told you my clothes hurt. I could have told you all of those things. But those weren't the questions anybody was asking. So that's where we need to be talking, meeting us at our level, having the conversations. And if you really want to be working with us, give us the tools we need, not the tools you need. And that's what we're really looking for in terms of
That's so powerful. It's hard to follow. But so the plus minus thing, you know, I've thought a lot about this as well and heard about that talk. I didn't get to hear it, but I heard people talking about it. And a couple things. I mean, you know, I have certainly met, you know, I work, as you gathered today, I work with kids, you know, 0 to 20 or 21, and I've certainly met kids with autism who are doing well, and I don't think has a comorbidity. You know, 11-year-old boy, really supportive family, you know, pretty fluent verbal, has these social challenges you might expect, but is supported through them, and you know, has good sense of himself, and you know, is doing fine, and you know, and not per se having a lot more challenges in some ways than other middle schoolers. So, you know, I think that does occur. However, I don't think I can go with the idea that this autism minus idea that there is no problem for not that person, but for most of the kids that I do work with who are, you know, significantly language impaired, as best we can measure, have significant intellectual disability. I don't think I can go with the idea that there isn't impairment there. Forget autism. If you can't communicate or communicate efficiently, that's an impairment. I don't really, given that our society, such as it is highly verbally dependent, it's an impairment, just as having, you know, if you were blind, I think that's an impairment. It's an impairment that can be worked on and, you know, supported, but it's still an impairment. The fact, you know, not to make light of it, I mean, but just to say, like, you know, if we were in a society where you were judged, your career achievement was judged by how full a head of hair you had, then I would be greatly impaired, right? So, I mean, it is, you know, I mean, it just, so, I don't think I can go with that. Even if that child who's nonverbal or minimally verbal is doing okay, you know, isn't having major issues, whatever, that's still an impairment. So you know, so I don't think I can go with that piece of it. I think on the, you know, people say the higher functioning end of the spectrum, usually what they mean is fluent verbal and probably, you know, in IQ or intelligence in the normal average range or superior range. You know, I think it does occur, and so that's, I guess, thoughts about that. And so when I hear, you know, I don't actually know who Dr. Gilbert works with, but when I heard that, I was like, he must work with high-functioning folks only. Because if he spent 5 minutes with the folks I'm with, the idea that there isn't impairment, it doesn't even pass the straight face test for me.
I don't know, I always have more questions than answers. I do know, I first heard Noah talk, I think 3 years ago at the communication conference, and Becca and I have talked as well. And every time I listen to them talk, I feel like I'm sitting at the feet of the masters, because I'm the outsider. So
finally.
And I gotta work on my language. I mean, I'm getting better, but I have a lot of work to do on my language. So this is quite a learning experience for me. And I understand what Matt is saying as well. I'm just saying, I have more questions than I have answers.
Thanks. We had a question, Caitlin?
Hello. I wanted to ask, well, this was originally for Dr. Siegel, but in hearing some of the responses, I wanted to hear a little bit more from everyone. But when addressing these, when you see somebody presenting with a co-occurring disorder, and particularly in your clinic, but then also the opinions, you know, of those who have autism, what would you say, like, in your practice, do you look at the comorbidities first? Are you looking at that presentation, trying to look at that? And that's something that you had mentioned in your talk as well, about looking maybe at those co-occurring disorders first before any intervention, or are you trying to get at the behaviors first, trying to lower the level of behavior involvement in order to look at the co-occurring disorders? And then for those who have, you know, your opinions on what you think would be most helpful.
Okay, so I guess I would say it depends what's coming through the door and which door, right? So sometimes people walk through the door in an outpatient office and, you know, there's my child or an adult with autism and anxiety, like we're just, you know, so much anxiety, and so then it's like, well, you know, then we're gonna treat anxiety. How we treat it is part of what I was trying to talk about this morning. That doesn't mean, you know, in my mind, okay, Zoloft, bye. It means, you know, what's causing this anxiety, which I think, you know, Becca was speaking to much more eloquently than I can. So that, you know, that would be the approach there. In the particular world I'm in, what more often comes to the door, as I said, is behaviors, but again, trying to back up and say, well, what's driving the behavior? And if it turns out it's anxiety, then yeah, we want to treat that. I want to treat upstream, you know, and try to get more at sources. And it may not be me treating, but just trying to help people think about that, and then maybe someone else who it falls in their expertise. You know, and this happens a lot with, so when I used to, in the old days, see kids who didn't have developmental disabilities, just did, you know, general child psychiatry, it was a frequent presentation that a kid would come in and be anxious and inattentive, right? You know, 8-year-old boy, very anxious, very inattentive at school, and it was always, you had to, in my mind, you had to try to really ferret out, and I would give, you know, ADHD measures and anxiety measures and talk to everybody and try to figure out, to put it simplistically, what's primary. Because if you're really anxious, you're internally distracted by your worries often, and so you appear inattentive, or you may be inattentive, but do you conceptualize that as ADHD inattentive? You know, no, I would say then the anxiety is primary, and if I treat that, maybe the focus will get better. And on the flip side, if you're really inattentive, that can generate some anxiety or anxiety appearing symptoms. So in that setting, you're trying to figure out, so this issue of where do I go first, or similarly, and then I'll stop talking, for someone who has, even within one disorder, like OCD, you have the question of like, is the person, there's kind of a point, I think, for most people who work with folks with OCD, where it's like, this is so severe or so strong that we could do terrific CBT, but we're not going to break through, or we try and we're not, because it's just too, and so we need to turn it down, try to turn it down with medication, and then we're able to do the exposure response prevention, cognitive restructuring, etc. So those were just several examples of like you know, you're trying to figure that out depending on the situation.
Can I take this for a second, because I loved your question and both your responses, Ken and Matt, because it really speaks to the complexity around a big word here, phenomenology. You know, about the experience of autism, which can vary from person to person to person, and I think that's so important that we wrap our heads, around that. So your question, as I understood, was, what do we address first? And I think one of the, and it's strange for me to say, I think part of it is the efficacy and the advantage, if you will, the good stuff that comes out of blurring the lines. Like one of the good stuff that comes out of diagnoses is a trajectory. If I have a diagnosis, then then I can do this and this and this and this because I have a diagnosis. But given the many permutations that we're dealing with right now around the complexity of a profile, that falls on the ASD spectrum, and then overlays with a likely mental illness, that I think we have to kind of be very humble and say, listen, you know what? I got to proceed with real caution here, and kind of get to know this person, get to know what this person's experience of the world is before I start prescribing and describing a response. So your question was hard because it's not always obvious what to do first. It's really what to do, period. But I will say that what you want to do, period, is get a sense of what that person's phenomenology is, which is really their experience of the world is, and that takes a little time. So even with a diagnosis, and I think that's the problem with the DSM, and the ISD, and all the classification systems, which serve an enormous function, I think it's really important to take all of that with a grain of salt and say, listen, I gotta hear from this person. Yeah.
I think for me, it's an interesting question because it brings up this idea of in what context are you coming in? So if I was to come in to go see a psychiatrist, more than likely the thing that I would be coming in to talk about is something related to my anxiety and something related to my depression. Those are going to be the big flaggy ones that are in my way and preventing me from doing the things that I want to be doing or need to be doing or whatever. So as a person, as an adult person, I'm able to say, those are my priorities when I come in the door. I got to handle my autism. Don't you worry about that. Right? But I'm here for this big emergency thing that's happening. But when I go now, as an adult and an advocate, I can go now to the doctor and say, right now this is bothering me, right? I can go to the doctor and say, I'm having migraines. They're different, they're changing, this is going on. And my doctor now has to treat my migraines as he would treat anybody else with migraines. But now he has to think about it in the context of my autism. So when I go to the doctor, I also have high blood pressure. When I go to the doctor and he wants to treat my migraines, he also has to keep in mind my high blood pressure. Now, is he treating my high blood pressure? No, my cardiologist is treating my high blood pressure. But does he have to think about my high blood pressure when he's treating me? Yes, right? Some of the medications for high blood pressure can cause anxiety. Are they affecting me, right? So there's a bigger question that we're really starting to ask. What are the differences medically that we're seeing in people on the spectrum versus people not on the spectrum? Now, medically, I can tell you that we all know anecdotally within the community that we don't need as much medication, those of us on the spectrum, for anything, any medication. That's not something that people know. And if you go in, and for me, I was misdiagnosed most of my life. So don't really trust you guys, sorry. But, you know, I'm over it now, sort of. But it's, you know, that's the kind of stuff that you're like, you go in and you're looking to somebody for that help. Well, I went in and my mom went in and we all went looking for help from the time that I turned 9 years old. Well, I had social anxiety, I had social phobia, I had early onset schizophrenia, I had manic depression, I had bipolar, I had reading troubles. Apparently, even though I was reading at an adult level in 3rd grade, and I was really struggling in math, I don't know where that came from, but I mean, all of those things, and I carry those with me. They are small scars along my life, and people's words that create the negative self-talk that many of us on the spectrum live with, and it all comes from this idea, right? But if somebody walks in your door and you start with, they're a person walking in my door, and they have this problem that they're coming to see me for, the only reason that autism really needs to come into that conversation is, how is that affecting the way I want to treat this thing that they're here for? But where I feel we really need to start, with our kids especially, is teaching the self-advocacy, teaching the self-awareness of, this is what my body's feeling like. Sometimes that's hard for us on the spectrum. I can go days and have somebody have to remind me to go to the bathroom because I'm so involved in whatever it is that I'm working on. So we're kind of working in this relationship, and how do we give people their humanness back, but at the same time be informed by what the autism and how that can be affecting it. So how do we walk that line? And how do we give our kids the ability to go into the doctor's office and say, this is what I'm feeling, and by the way, I have autism. Because that is affecting the way that your doctor sees it. And if we're ashamed of it, then our kids are going to be ashamed of it, and we're not giving them the skills that they're going to need, because Asperger's and autism isn't going to kill them. That's not going to be their death wish. They're going to be adults. And what do we do then? So we're talking about these really impaired, and I do agree with you 100%. Not being able to communicate, whether you're verbal or not, because I could not communicate, but I was verbal, hyper-verbal. And some of it was epithelial. So that's another one that we can talk about another time. But, you know, that's kind of the idea, right? Why are we not giving our children the skill sets to say? I mean, our nonverbal kids, man, you know, their lives are so different. It's almost like the spectrum lives in two different worlds, and it really shouldn't be that anymore. But the nonverbal kids really, man, if I could change things about the way that we talk to the nonverbal people, if every single person in the world talked correctly to a nonverbal person and learned that skill set, it would help you to talk to anybody, right? It teaches you that communication and that respect. And we have to give that to get it. So I think, yeah, let's use our right language and let's give our kids, especially the kids that don't have the verbal ability, some other alternative way to communicate how they want to be treated.
So,
because that's really it.
Awesome. So we're running, we're just about out of time, and we had one final question, so I'd like to hear the final question, but in response, if people want to both respond to Lindsay's question, but also if you have one take-home message or nugget or thing you want to communicate to this audience before the end of our wonderful day and before we have a raffle after that, that would be great. So, Lindsay.
Thank you. So I just wanted to build a little bit off of the question that had been asked previously, and also off of Dr. Guidow's comment about kind of distributing services in less privileged areas. And I was wondering about how we could better address this population of individuals with co-occurring disorders in low-income areas where these children are receiving most of their services in schools.
So again, if panelists could respond to that, but then also if you have any kind of button you want to send people home with, now's the time.
I'll give my colleagues a minute to think about that one. But I want to respond to the previous question because I didn't get a chance to. It was a very good question, and that's why we took so long to talk about it. I wanted to say that treatment has to come from an understanding of causality, and the DSM doesn't cover that at all. It just covers behavior, which I think is a very shallow and bad way to attack a problem, but sometimes it's all we have. That said, in autism, it's not all we have. We do understand causality and what's going through someone's mind. And if you have an autistic person with depression, you have to ask yourself, where did it come from? And unfortunately, when I was young and more optimistic, I had the idea, you know, well, autistic people are fine automatically, you know, all this stuff's societal, which is, I've seen over and over again, is just not true. We have an instinct to push out change because it's overwhelming, and our hypersensitivity to sensory stuff and our confusion about what people mean also makes us push away stuff, which is very necessary and healthy for people. And without variety, without social interaction, and without getting outdoors, humans get depressed regardless of whether you're on the spectrum. And unfortunately, this means a whole lot of autistic people are going to be, if not majorly depressed, at least dysthymic, because we're not getting these very basic things humans need to be okay. And when I've worked with people, or in myself, I always remember this has to happen. And if it doesn't happen, very little else that you're covering is going to matter, because this person's still going to feel terrible. And so you have to address that in a specific way while trying to handle the fact that our brain doesn't want us to do that as often as maybe we should. And this, anyway, I guess I'll leave it at that. My take-home message is come see Asperger's or Us in Europe next week.
Wow. I have such a weird position on all of this stuff because my experience in school was odd. I turned 18 in 1994, and anybody who knows anything about autism knows the significance of this happening, right? It was like the universe didn't want me to know that I had autism. So throughout school, I was really, really struggling, and a lot of those struggles really, came from the fact that My teachers didn't have the experience to deal with me. Everything was compartmentalized. Autism doesn't allow for that kind of stuff. All of our stuff exists inherently with itself. It's innate to go together. And it didn't make sense for them to be pulling all of these things out. And I talked briefly about what had happened to me in the reading. That experience was actually as a result of bullying from a teacher. So when we talk about our kids in school, and we always talk about bullying, right? We never go and talk about the teachers and their experience. Now, I've found as an adult that a lot of it in this industry, much of it comes out of the frustration as much from the teachers. But I think what we're missing is really supporting our educators in their knowledge base, right? They go, if the school wants to pay for them to come to something like this and take the day off, they come. But they don't get that option. And yet, at the same time, they are the people that are sitting with our kids. They are the people that are taking care of them during the day. They are the people that are interacting and making them the person they're going to be. So how are we not giving them the tools that they need? And I think that's really where we need to start, is to keep the information coming into the schools, give it to the providers, go directly to them. I mean, I myself do that now. I really was keen on really being very specific about working with people on the spectrum, and then I realized that I could do better dissemination of information and better working with people if I went to the providers first. And they could deal with it with all of their clients and talk about it more, and we can get it out there. So there's a faster way to get to more people. And I think if we could do that for our teachers, they would be grateful.
Thank you. Any other final thought?
I think my takeaway from this is please do something about the fact that there's nothing out there. That's so disturbing to me. I now want to go home and write an article just to have something out there. So please go home and do research.
Can I just add to this before? I know the day is closing and I don't want to keep us but a second, but because of what you said, because of what Noah just said, I would just, just kind of like suggest that we remember, our shared humanity and whatever we know about a particular diagnosis. Remember, all that literature keeps changing, and what we describe as the cutoff points, and it just keeps changing and changing and changing. And I suggest that we are much more alike than we are different, and that we not be over-compelled by a particular diagnosis, and get to know. I certainly try my best to do this in my private practice and in my everyday life. Get to know the human being, even above and beyond any particular diagnosis, and in that be very accepting of the fact that there's much more likely, there's a great likelihood rather, that there's much more going on than just one simple statement on a form about a diagnosis, that a person is much more than a particular classification. And I think if we walk away from that, from today, which so embraces that, I think we're probably on the right track.
Okay, I'll give you
Thank you.
Sorry, I'll give you my 20-second takeaway, which is push for multidisciplinary care and treatment. That's I think when there are issues, I mean, I can count on one hand the number of times I felt like one discipline could take care of something that was significant. So push for that. So when I mentioned we have a multidisciplinary outpatient clinic, I mean in our psychiatry clinic we have a full-time speech pathologist and a full-time OT. In my agency that I work for said, well, we can't, when I proposed this, we can't have those medical providers in our psychiatric clinic. We don't know how to bill for speech pathology. So we're gonna figure it out because they're gonna be here because that's the treatment team. So push for that and look for programs that have that.
I'd like to respond to Lindsay's question, but I'm going to do just make a closing comment. At one point in my career, I studied Tourette syndrome for about 15 or 20 years. And I remember when the awareness of co-occurring conditions or situations or problems, however you want to perceive that, in Tourette syndrome emerged. And I and some of my colleagues were viciously attacked for even suggesting such a thing, because it somehow tainted our conceptualization of Tourette's syndrome. And, okay, that's enough on that. And then to live through this awakening phase of co-occurring concerns in autism spectrum disorder, I'm very optimistic about the future, and I'm very excited about the progress that's currently being made. A lot of issues with the inner city. I used to teach in the inner city. A lot of issues with the inner city. That aside, I remain optimistic about the future.
And with that optimism, let's give our panel a round of applause.